Russia's army chief says up to 1,000 Ukrainian troops crossed into the Kursk region in southwestern Russia and advanced towards the city of Zudza. Thousands of civilians were evacuated from the area. Russia released footage of what it says are Ukrainian tanks and military vehicles on Russian territory. Moscow said that it launched air and artillery firepower to repel the attack. If confirmed, it would be the largest cross-border incursion by Ukrainian troops since the start of the war.
The internet and a lot of the news these days is absolutely abuzz with a fairly major incursion by the Ukrainian armed forces onto Russian territory. Many people are trying to figure out, what this means. Is this mean a shift in the war? Is it evidence that the Russian military is not as good as they thought? Is this going to be a big push that continues on deeper into Russian territory that causes Russia to pull back some of its other forces? A lot of these questions need to be answered. And we're going to do a deep dive on this today because things are not quite what they seem. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone because very often the Western press loves to hype up things that appear to be good for the Ukraine side. They like to downplay anything that might appear to be good from the Russian side. But the bottom line is, what is the reality on the ground? What is the military reality? And what can we expect from these events coming forward? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, while this incursion has definitely caught Russia by surprise, and by the way, you can see on the map here, this is where the incursion is, this Sudza up in the top there. You can see the city of Kursk and then the little dot there where it says Sudza. That's where this is taking place. So that's where it is in connection with the rest of the front line and where most of the fighting has been going on here. But while this location has in fact been surprising, and it definitely caught the Russians by surprise, especially Vladimir Putin, the fact that it was coming should not have been a surprise. Here is an interview that Zelensky did with Bret Baier in February of this year, talking about this very action.
To continue our successful story on the Black Sea, and we will do it. I will not now go deeply to details, but they will get some surprises. Russians. Yeah, that's very important. So South is very important to defend East, where they have more than 200,000 soldiers, also very important to defend. And of course, we will prepare new counteroffensive, new operation. And of course, I'm not speaking that we will just stay. Of course, it depends on a lot of things.
So I remember even at the time, you may recall, we commented on that clip there, that when he's talking about having a major offensive, that's coming on the heels. Remember, that's in February. So that was just a few months after the disaster of 2023's counteroffensive, where the Ukraine side had literally months and more than a half a year to prepare, 9 months in some areas. They had literally thousands of armored vehicles from the West, millions of rounds of ammunition, allegedly plenty of time to train a lot of troops, et cetera, and it completely broke their teeth on the very first line of Russian defense, which they never fully penetrated. So for him to be talking in February that they may launch another counteroffensive just seemed a little bit odd. But you see that a lot of things that happen on the Ukraine side don't really make a lot of military sense. And we're going to see that this one, I think, is going to fall into that category as well. This is not the good news that many on the Ukraine side want to hear. And we also have to bear in mind that this is a war, and the outcome of a specific engagement or a specific battle plays a part in it. But the ultimate issue is, how is the war going to go? And the fundamentals that go into winning and losing a war are often different than the fundamentals of winning and losing a battle. Though in this case, I think you're going to find probably the outcome is similar to both the battle and the war in this case, and for similar reasons in terms of what's capable, what the offensive side, in this case, the Ukrainians, are capable of, and what the Russians' defenses are capable of. So first of all, we'll just say that the Russians are definitely embarrassed by this. Putin has got to be unhappy about this because really for the second time in this war, the Ukrainian side was able to amass a fairly large grouping of forces to conduct an offensive that caught the Russians by surprise. This happened most infamously for the Russian side back in the fall of 2022, when there was a large formation of Ukrainian forces in the Kharkiv area that assembled that Russia wasn't aware of, and then they launched this big offensive, and they completely swept away a fairly small Russian National Guard type defensive in the Kursk area, and claimed a huge battlefield win and definitely a PR win, because they genuinely did take like I think it was something like 6,000 square kilometers or whatever. Russia was not prepared for it. They hadn't dug any defenses in, etc. They got caught with their pants down and paid a huge price for it. They took them probably closer to 6 to 9 months to actually recover from a lot of that. They eventually did, which underscores why the difference between a battle and a war. Russia lost that battle in the Kharkiv area there, but the fundamentals of the war were still on their side. Even at that time, they were. Now, even much more so are they on Russia's side in this case. So first of all, though, let's talk about tactically what is happening on the ground. The Russian side did not expect there to be a big incursion here, because they see, on the whole 600-mile line of contact, that's where the big fights are going on, and that's where Ukraine has been putting most of their personnel. Reasonably so, because that's where their biggest strategic risk is. So Russia took what we call tactical risk in the north along their border by having border control points, something like National Guard, not some of their higher trained troops, and not that many of them, because they just didn't expect to fight. Well, they got one, and so there has been some fairly robust gains by the Ukraine side, genuinely so. Here's Military Summary Channel talking about what has been accomplished so far, and what you're going to see is a fairly big bulge into the Russian side, and then he's going to talk about what has happened up to this point, what has happened today, and what may be coming in part 2. Watch this.
The Ukrainians during the previous day conducted reconnaissance and force operations towards Kareneva, and some Ukrainian vehicles managed to answer, and the sources are saying that Ukrainians even managed to capture some buildings. But the Russians conducted counteroffensives in this area and forced the Ukrainians to fall back. And this information was confirmed by different mappers and different military experts. As a result of this short battle, the Ukrainians returned back towards the village of Lyubimovka and the village of Novoivanovka, or maybe towards this tree line, where later they were destroyed as a result of missile strike. Furthermore, the Ukrainians during the previous nights and during the previous day conducted significant number of attempts to attack the Russian positions in the village of Viktorovka. The same story, the Russians brought additional forces and repelled the Ukrainian attack, and the Ukrainians suffered losses and were forced to fall back. So in another important statement, according to, for example, the report of the group of forces North, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians have lost around 40% of the personnel of the first wave of attack. And as you can see, the first wave of attack was already exhausted, suffered critical probably losses, and most likely today on the 8th of August, the Ukrainians will introduce the second wave of attack, and they will continue offensive operation. There will be more attempts to attack the Russians in Viktorovka, Maloloknya, and the Ukrainians will try to make more attempts to attack Kareneva. And today, as I understand, we're going to start receiving videos and geolocations exactly from these two cities.
Now, here's the questions that need to be asked and answered. What is the objective of the Ukraine side here? What do they hope to accomplish with this? Is this the beginning of a major push where they're going to try to maybe go all the way up to the city of Kursk in that area, a major area? They're trying to push the forces far enough back and then dig in so that they can force the Russians to try and send reinforcements. I've heard many people talk about that already, that's one of the purposes, is that the Ukraine side hopes that Russia will divert some of its offensive forces elsewhere in theater so that they can try and defend against this. Now, that misses the point if you're on the Ukraine side here, or it misses the capabilities on the Russian side, because this, as we saw in that first map there, that the current line of contact in the east is over 600 miles long. It is a huge strip there. All that red and the lines across it are huge. So Russia has, according to the Ukraine side, according to Ukraine senior military officials, Russia currently has somewhere around 600,000 troops in Ukraine fighting along that front, and they may have by the end of this year, so just a few months hence, up to almost 700,000. So even more could be coming. The Ukraine side of the intelligence also reports publicly that the Russia has between 200,000 and 300,000 troops out of contact, which means that they are not along the front lines, that they're stationed in various locations in Russia or Belarus where they can be brought to action here. So Russia has a huge, basically strategic reserve, theater reserves we call, that they can use, whether they previously had them earmarked for an offensive at some point later this summer or early fall. Now then they may have to use some of them here. But the problem is it's not going to draw them away from other places where they have on the front line. And for Ukraine to launch this offensive, they are now having to use troops that they could otherwise use in some of the areas where they're on the defensive and losing ground. So that means that they now don't have those troops where the country is being physically threatened. We're going to see that in a minute. But they also don't have enough offensive capability. And listen, folks, here's what it just puzzles me from a military perspective. All the things that we saw that the Ukraine side lacked in the 2023 offensive, for the most part, they still lack. And in some cases, they're even less capable now on offensive than they were in 2023. Now, on the positive side, unlike in 2023, the Ukraine side is attacking the areas where Russia doesn't have 5 lines of defensive belts. So they may think, well, we can penetrate up further. And as we see self-evidently, that's what happened in the areas here. But if you don't have staying power, if you don't have not just 2 waves, as military summary it says that the Russians are expecting, but if you have to have 3, 4, and 5 waves, and you have to have a lot more than 1,000 troops. That's basically the size of 2 battalions, and 2 battalions trying to invade a country. I mean, it's laughable on the surface of it, even when you say that out loud. Yet that's what's being done here. So the increasing probability is that Russia does have quite a bit more than 2 battalions of forces that can be redirected onto this location. And if Ukraine doesn't have like multiple thousands of more of well-trained and equipped troops and air cover to be able to support this, and air defense to support what's coming with the Russians, because certainly they're going to redirect the superior air forces up there where they have a lot more of them. These guys don't stand a chance. And probably within a couple of weeks or maybe even less, these guys could be driven out. Now, it is possible that they could try and dig in. But again, all that's going to do is delay the inevitable. And that has no impact on the larger war. Now, as I said, Russia has been embarrassed by this. And certainly it's a bad day for the Russian president, who said this, by the way.
The Kiev regime has carried out another large-scale provocation. It is indiscriminately firing various types of weapons, including missiles at civilian buildings, residential buildings, and ambulances.
Now, of course, many on the West and in Ukraine will call that crocodile tears or whatever, but it's definitely been an embarrassment. So Putin had to go in, and that was mainly for domestic consumption. It wasn't for anybody outside, because the people on the outside at the moment, and I'm talking about the West and Ukraine, are certainly cheering this on. They're saying, yeah, we finally brought the war onto Russian territory. Here's an additional problem. What is the result of that going to be? Is that going to cause problems for Russia? Is that going to cause a reduction in their military capability? Is it going to have any hope to change the outcome of the war? Almost certainly it won't. What it is more likely to do is to get angry, is Putin to have anger and to push even harder in some areas and cause even more problems. Now, listen, we got to understand that Russia's air defense and air offense capabilities and their ability to launch missiles throughout Ukraine is considerable. And Ukraine side has been losing the capability to defend against the air power, especially as this year has continued to draw on. They don't have as many air defense capabilities. They don't have enough air defense missiles. And if Russia wanted to, they could expand their target list to hit other things. And who knows what Russia's going to do in retaliation to this. But those are the things that could spawn off this. It could actually get worse for Ukraine, even if this penetration doesn't result to, if they're not able to keep it. And we'll see how that goes along as well. Interesting. The United States naturally was asked about this, and Matt Miller, spokesman for the United States, was asked, "What is the U.S. view here?" Interesting, his response here. He takes kind of a non-comment here, but then he does add one thing at the end about our policies having not changed. Watch this.
I will leave it to them to speak to what it is what kind of operations they're conducting and what their goals are. That's appropriate that they speak to that publicly, not us. I have seen the statements from the Russian government is a little bit rich, them calling it a provocation, given Russia violated Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. You said 900 days. It actually goes back much longer than that. It goes back to 2014 and continues to illegally occupy Ukrainian territory. Ultimately, the decisions about how Ukraine conducts its military operations are decisions that Ukraine makes. Nothing with respect to the policy that we announced several months ago with respect to allowing the equipment that we provide to be used in strikes across the border to target sites, Russian military sites just across the border. Nothing about that policy has changed.
So, yeah, I'm not going to talk about the war here. I'm going to poke a finger at what Putin has said, because that's apparently what we love to do. It's a media hit on the Russian side, and he's going to make fun of Putin, and then that we're going to not change any of our policies. So we're going to continue to allow Ukraine to use American weapons and ammunition on Russian soil. Now, listen, folks, I know that we don't want, from the United States side and the Western side, we don't want there to be any consequences to our actions. But the more we keep doing that, the more we keep antagonizing the Russian side with American weapons, and especially as Russian citizens or troops are killed on Russian territory by American weapons, we increase the probability that one day that Putin makes good on his threat to arm our enemies and those who are antagonistic to the United States. And of course, we're still waiting on potential issues in the Middle East of possibly an expansion of that war by Iran responding to what Israel did by assassinating someone in its capital city from the negotiating partner from the Hamas side, et cetera. So we're still wondering if that's going to happen. And we know Russian officials and Russian military planes have been landing in Tehran, potentially bringing the weapons, air defense missiles. It's uncertain what, but lots of conversations going on there. So while Matt Miller wants to talk about poking Russia and making fun of their president, we're continuing to lay the groundwork for the potential that this has negative implications elsewhere, even beyond the front lines here. Now, I want to talk more about what the implications for this war are right here, for this action here. Now, here's an interesting commentary from an analyst on CNN, because everyone in the West is trying to put a good face on this, but inadvertently, this military expert here kind of shows why this is not such a great idea. Watch this.
This comes at an exceptionally complex time for Kiev. They are under great pressure on the Donetsk front lines near a town called Pokrovsk, a key military hub for them. They're losing theirs steadily but slowly. And there are other suggestions too that along that front line they're running out of manpower. So already today we're seeing Ukrainian observers going, well, what are you doing deep inside Russia if we're losing on other parts of the front line instead? All that aside, this is a rare moment of what you might call good news for Ukraine, where they're projecting strength, catching Moscow off guard, and presumably now forcing Russia to rush reinforcements around and change its calculus on the front line.
You see, he sits there and talks about, hey, there's some real issues on the front line here. Ukraine is being pushed back in key areas, and especially in a place called Pokrovsk. I'm going to show you more about that shortly. That's actually quite significant. But then he just says, but hey, this is a rare moment of good news. And that just shows you the mentality of the Western side here. Instead of saying, this is a war, it's not a battle. So we need to take actions that can either win a war, that can change the outcome, or we need to talk about having a negotiated settlement so we don't lose even more. That's what a rational thinking person does. But you see that even though with his mouth, he sits there and acknowledges some real problems with what's going on right now and the difficult conditions with which Ukraine has. But then he just kicks over to, but hey, it's a rare moment of good news and good stories, et cetera. Folks, that doesn't make any difference. In a war, it doesn't make any difference. If all you care about is getting the media's seen today, if you only care about what this current media cycle is, then I guess that's something you can do, and you can celebrate that. Yay, we have good news, because it is embarrassing for the Russian side. They have moved on to Russian territory, but can they stay there? Now we've seen this play out in periods of time before, and I want to show you the map here, if we could. Gary, show that first map for that. This is again the whole the Ukraine and all the red stuff is the war where you've been used to seeing it. Sudza up in the upper right hand corner, you see the city of Kursk. You can see Sudza there, that little dot here. Now here's the a map that we're going to zero in on that from the Institute for the Study of War. And you can see all this blue area here is on the Russian side. You can see kind of in the lower left-hand corner, that jaggedy line there. That's the Russian-Ukraine border. And so now all the area in the thatched blue zone there is territory that the Ukraine side has now moved into. So it's too early to say that they have captured it, but they are certainly in those areas right now. You may have recognized, especially in that kind of finger-looking situation on the upper left-hand corner there, jutting up toward the northeast, southwest compass mark. That's what we saw in the military summary channel, where the Ukraine side had launched some troops there, but they were being pushed back. And so that was phase one. And then now they're looking at phase two. Now, here's where we get to some interesting analysis. Now, what I'm telling you is, I think that based on my assessment and the observation that I can have on several different inputs, that Russia has continued to mobilize up to 30 to 40,000 troops per month. They're losing far, far less than that. So the overall size of the Russian troops are gaining. They have military deals cut with North Korea to get missiles and artillery shells. They have deals with Iran to get drones, and they have some manufacturing things there. The Russian national military industrial complex, the defense industrial base, continues to expand. It's now cranking out, almost 7 days a week, 3 shifts, et cetera. So they're continuing to push out lots and lots of capabilities. Those are the things, the fundamentals that go into who can win a major war, especially if you're talking about an attritional contest between two armed forces. The side that has the most men, the most ability to supply them, and the biggest ability to continue to have a defense industrial base that on its side is virtually certain to be the winner. And it's almost impossible to imagine to be the other way. So this incursion does nothing to that. But then you have this curious information coming out for the Institute for the Study of War, where they have a different view on things. And this is a commentary from that's also talked about from some of the Ukrainian officials. And the ISW says, and you can see in this blue area at the top, it says Ukraine's main intelligence directorate head, Kirilko Budnov, assessed on August 7th that the Russian offensive potential will culminate within 1.5 to 2 months, generally consistent with ISW's assessment on Russia's current offensive capability. So Russia has basically been on the offensive, since in this whole calendar year, really. And so they're starting to make some significant progress in many places, but especially a place called Pokrovsk, which again, I'm going to show you in a second. But before we get there, I want to show you some of the things that have been done before, because I'm not sure what ISW is basing its claim on, that Russia is about to run out of gas, when I just showed you that their army is getting bigger by the month. They have military deals, actual treaties with other countries to physically give them war support, and their own defense industrial base continues to expand. So it's very unclear upon what ISW is basing its assessment, other than wishful thinking. But look, this whole issue with the Kursk area is not something we haven't seen before. Last year, you may recall that the Ukraine side made a big incursion over the Dnieper River, kind of in the southern part of the zone there, in a place called Krinky. And this is from October of last year, that with raids across the Dnieper River, the New York Times said, Ukraine may be seeking a new front in the war. And what that subhead there, if you can't read it in the blue, it says military experts are reporting extensive strikes on Russian-held territory in the south, potentially with the goal of establishing a bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper River. Now, Dnipro, sorry. That was from the beginning. When I saw that happening, and I made comments on our channel earlier, that made no military sense at all, because the Ukraine side was expending enormous amounts of personnel. They had lots of boats that they were going to try to ferry troops back and forth across there. They actually did get on the Russian side of that river. They did establish a beachhead, and that was hailed. I remember, I'll never forget this one, because many of the Western media, especially Forbes, said, okay, because this was kind of at the end of the failure of the 23 offensive, but they were saying, no, this shows that they are making progress. They have made success, and they're moving across here, and they're going to open a new front on the south. But here was the problem then, as is the problem now. They didn't have the capacity to exploit that. So sure, you got a foothold on the other side of a river, but can you project power beyond that? And the same reason they couldn't project into all the area of the 2023 offensive is the same reason they couldn't do it in the Krinky area down there. They don't have the engineering ability to go into deep into Russian-held territory. They couldn't get through the minefields. They couldn't get through the defensive fortifications that have been set up, and they couldn't go against that many men. And the terrain itself didn't facilitate that. Further, they didn't have the armor capability and the air support. One of the key things that was identified by everybody, they didn't have the air power to project to provide cover for that while they moved troops forward, and the air defense to keep the Russian side from moving into here. All of those things played out exactly as you would expect, and Ukraine never went beyond beyond that foothold. And then finally, after 7 or 8 months, I think just a month or two ago, they finally said, yeah, that's we admit that it didn't work, and then they abandoned the area and they went back. Of course, you didn't see here. All the Western media weren't talking about that one, or weren't saying how it was a bunch of disaster, but that's how it worked out. And now then I think the same thing is going to play out here. We're just in the front end of this thing, so we'll see how it plays out over time. But this is also similar to an area that many in the West, in America in particular, may recall from World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. What that was in December 1944, when toward the end of the war, the war was all but lost. All the fundamentals showed that even though the Nazi side still had large numbers of troops, the cumulative weight between the West and the East, between the Soviet Union and the Western allies, in terms of manpower, in terms of industrial capacity, and all the things that go along with that ammunition-wise, everything was going against the German side at that time. They didn't have any capacity, but instead of acknowledging that or seeking negotiated settlement, they launched this big offensive in December 1944, and they pushed deep into the Bastogne area, and they initially made a lot of progress. They went very deep, but then the fundamentals played out as they always do, and that bulge was cut off. And then by January, the latter part of January, everything that they had tried had failed, and all the troops that they had put into that offensive were dead or captured, and were then continuing to be driven back. And the war had its predictable end in April of 1945. That's how it worked out then. And by the way, just kind of at a point here, talking about the Battle of the Bulge, we're going to have it on our show at 1 o'clock this afternoon, kind of a special treat that we have. Dale Dye, who was in the movie Saving Private Ryan and the Band of Brothers, is going to be on our show to talk about how his realism and the things that he does, that he put on those movies, and his own combat experience. And he's going to talk about what real combat is probably looking like here on this war. We might even talk about this situation here. So you'll want to see that at 1 o'clock today. But moving back to what we're talking about here, I've mentioned a couple of times the issue of Pokrovsk. So while the media attention is all up on the Kursk area because the Western media is looking for anything positive, what they're not talking about as much is what's going on in Pokrovsk. And over on the Eastern Front there's a major battle going on, which friend of our show, Alex from History Legends, talked about earlier today. He's got a video, by the way, and we'll put this in our description here later. But you should go watch the whole video that he put out. But here's this taste of what he did and why this part is so important.
We're gonna focus on this part of the front, on the western side of Avdiivka. What happened in the last few days is an unmitigated disaster for the Ukrainian army. That was the frontline situation on the 1st of June. Then fast forward a month to the 1st of July, and that's the situation now in early August. The Russians literally advanced 12 kilometers in that direction, 9 kilometers in this one, and 6 kilometers there. The main reason behind this military debacle can be attributed to negligence. Complete negligence. We all remember how Ukraine bragged about building a powerful line of fortifications. Yet, in reality, in so many sectors of the front, Ukrainian commanders did not bother to build any fortifications. And when they did, these fieldworks ended up being fully exposed and poorly planned out. In the end, the Ukrainian army could not rely on a defense in depth. The moment the first line of defense crumbles, it's GG well played.
Now, here's the really important part of that. If the Pokrovsk area falls, it's kind of in the center of the zone of that red area that we showed you in the big map in there. It's really important because it is one of the hubs of logistics areas where the Ukraine side is trying to provide support to keep the Russians from pushing through there. It also represents among the last of the defensive areas that have been built, for some of which are going all the way back to 2014. And as Alex showed you in there, even some of the defensive works they have not been strong enough. But there's very little, according to many satellite imagery, beyond that. If Russia breaks through that, then some of these, as I told you, reportedly up to 200,000-300,000 Russian troops that are not in contact yet could then be used to put a lot of pressure on this area, and there could be a major breakthrough. So if this is where you get back into what makes sense. If all you care about is media, then what they're doing in the Kursk area makes sense. But what is that going to do for the war effort? When you see that the most important part of the front right now is the Pokrovsk area, and you have all of these troops that you had, then you would most likely, the most reasonable thing to do is to use them here, is to have some sort of counterattack, a tactical counterattack to push the Russians back, to maybe try a flank penetration to cause the Russian forces to have to withdraw from that salient there. So as Alex showed you, instead of continuing to push on towards Pokrovsk, maybe they would have to stop and redirect and worry about a flank attack and maybe even cut them off, the Russians off. But we'll never know because they're not going to try that. So instead, they're doing something where there's not as much Russian forces up there. So they had the greater opportunity to make a big penetration up there, a big show of force, but not much else. And that is the real problem. So Alex talked about there's a negligence and just incompetence in how they're building their defensive. We also talked about that same thing in the Kursk operation, where they came 6 or 10 kilometers deep into Ukraine a few months back. Was the same thing, that there were no border fortifications, even though the Ukraine side claimed that they had been building them for a long time. So now Russia moved in there. They're still there to this day, and Ukraine has continued to have to put reinforcements up there to try and push the Russians back, and they keep having combat losses there that they just can't sustain. They can't afford that. So they're fighting up now north of Kharkiv. Now then, they pushed in the Kursk area, which is not too far from Sumy. There are reports that the Russians themselves may be ready to launch an additional attempt in the Sumy area, and they're losing in the Pokrovsk area. And that, of course, doesn't even talk about some of the other areas like the Kupiansk area, further south along the Dnipro River, et cetera. So lots of places where the Ukraine side is being pushed back. And this one showy force here is not going to change the outcome of any of those things. Combat fundamentals still apply, regardless of what anybody in the media wants to tell you. And that's where the situation is right now. We'll watch and see how this plays out. Who knows? Maybe Ukraine has some force that's even bigger than the one we've seen that's hidden, and maybe they'll continue to make penetrations, and the calculations could change. That could potentially cause Russia to have to move some of these other troops that they want to use in an offensive to move up in the defensive. We don't know that. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Deep Dive will continue to stay on top of this, and we'll bring you updates as it happens. But as of the moment, from what we can see now, what we know, this has just been a media diversion for the Ukraine side. It's going to get a lot more guys killed. It's not going to change anything, and it's doing nothing to defend against the real threat they have in the east in Pokrovsk. And that's all we have for you today, or for this episode here. But do join us again at 1 o'clock this afternoon, where Dale Dye is going to come on. It's a real treat. He's a great guy to talk to. He's got a lot of combat experience himself. Been a lot of movies you've probably seen. And he's going to give us his view of what that's like, what his experience has shown him about what's really going on the ground for this year. And then we've also got MIT Professor Ted Postal again at 3 o'clock today, and he's going to be telling us some things about the potential for Iran Israeli war and what might happen with the Iron Dome if Iran really does rain down lots of missiles, especially if it comes in association with Hezbollah. on the Lebanese border. You're not going to want to miss either one of those shows. We will see you at 1 and 3 o'clock this afternoon. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.